Dr. Emily Hartwell had driven through the night, her rental car's headlights cutting through the dense fog that clung to the winding mountain roads of rural Vermont. The GPS had lost signal 20 miles back, leaving her to navigate by instinct and the hand-drawn map Professor Morrison had sketched during their last conversation 3 weeks ago. That conversation now seemed like a lifetime ago. Morrison's voice crackling through the long-distance connection from his field station, his words punctuated by an excitement she hadn't heard since their graduate school days together at Harvard. "Emily, you have to see this place. Whitmore Hollow, completely intact 18th century settlement, abandoned overnight in 1798 according to local records. No signs of violence, no evidence of disease, just an entire community that simply vanished without explanation." Morrison was a respected anthropologist, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural speculation. When he called requesting her expertise in forensic archaeology, Emily had assumed they were dealing with a conventional historical mystery. Mass graves, perhaps, or evidence of some forgotten plague that had swept through the isolated mountain community. She hadn't expected to find Morrison's camp completely deserted when she finally located the dirt road leading to Whitmore Hollow. The field station consisted of 3 canvas tents arranged around a cold fire pit, research equipment scattered across folding tables that had been overturned by wind or something else entirely. Morrison's laptop sat open on one of the tables, its screen dark, the keyboard covered with a fine layer of morning dew that suggested it had been exposed to the elements for several days. Emily called out Morrison's name, her voice echoing strangely in the mountain air, but received no response. She checked her cell phone again, confirming what she already knew. No signal, no way to contact the outside world from this remote location tucked away in a valley that seemed to exist outside of normal geography. The silence was absolute, more profound than anything she had experienced in 20 years of archaeological fieldwork. No bird songs, no insect chorus, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush that covered the surrounding hills. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the very air were holding its breath. Emily began examining Morrison's research materials, looking for clues about what had happened to him and his small team. His field notes were meticulous as always, documenting the discovery and initial survey of Whitmore Hollow with scientific precision. But the entries grew increasingly strange as they progressed, filled with observations that contradicted everything Emily knew about her colleague's rational, methodical approach to archaeology. September 15th, initial survey complete. Village layout suggests population of approximately 200 residents. All structures intact, no evidence of fire or structural collapse. Most unusual preservation I've ever encountered. September 18th. Found personal belongings still in place throughout the village. Meals left on tables. Beds unmade as if occupants had simply stepped outside and never returned. No signs of hasty departure or struggle. September 22nd. Team members reporting strange dreams, all involving children's voices calling from the direction of the village center. Johnson claims he saw figures moving between the buildings at dawn, but thermal imaging shows no heat signatures. September 25th. Mitchell refuses to enter the village after sunset. Says he can hear singing coming from the old church, hymns in a language he doesn't recognize. I've recorded several hours of audio, but playback reveals only silence. The final entry was dated 3 days ago, written in handwriting that barely resembled Morrison's usual careful script. September 28th. They're not gone. They're waiting. The whole village is waiting for something, and I think I understand now what happened in 1798. God help me, I think I understand. Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She gathered Morrison's research materials and loaded them into her backpack, then began the half-mile hike down the overgrown trail that led to Whitmore Hollow itself. The path wound through ancient forests that seemed untouched by modern logging or development. Massive oak and maple trees formed a canopy so dense that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. creating a perpetual twilight that played tricks with depth perception and made every shadow seem to move with deliberate purpose. As she walked, Emily became aware of an oppressive quality to the silence, as if the forest were actively suppressing sound rather than simply lacking it. Her footsteps on the leaf-covered path seemed muffled, absorbed by something more than natural acoustic dampening. After 20 minutes of steady hiking, the trees began to thin, and Emily caught her first glimpse of Whitmore Hollow spread out in the valley below. The village was exactly as Morrison had described, a collection of wooden buildings arranged around a central green that looked as if it had been frozen in time. Colonial-era houses with steep-pitched roofs and diamond-pane windows, a small church with a simple bell tower, workshops and barns that spoke of a community designed for self-sufficiency in the harsh mountain environment. But there was something wrong with the scene, something that made Emily's trained eye for historical detail recoil with instinctive unease. The buildings were too perfect, too well-preserved for structures that had supposedly stood empty for over 2 centuries. Paint that should have faded and peeled still retained its original colors. Wooden shingles showed no signs of weather damage or rot. Even the glass in the windows appeared intact, reflecting the pale morning light with crystalline clarity. Emily approached the first house cautiously, her archaeological training overriding her growing sense of dread. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of the interior that made her heart race with professional excitement despite her fears. Inside, the house was a perfect time capsule of 18th century domestic life. Furniture arranged exactly as it might have been on any morning in 1798, a spinning wheel beside the fireplace with still wound around the spindle, a wooden cradle containing a small quilt that looked as if it had been placed there moments ago. On the kitchen table sat the remnants of a meal, pewter plates containing what had once been food but was now nothing more than dust and stains. A clay pitcher stood beside the plates, bone dry, but positioned with the careful precision of someone who had intended to return momentarily. Emily documented everything with her camera, taking detailed photographs of the room's contents while fighting the growing conviction that she was not alone in the house. Several times she spun around, certain she had heard footsteps or the whisper of fabric against wood, but the house remained empty and silent. The second floor revealed bedrooms that told the same story of sudden, inexplicable abandonment. Children's toys scattered on hand-hewn floors, clothes folded neatly in wooden chests, personal items that spoke of lives interrupted in the middle of ordinary daily routines. In the master bedroom, Emily found something that made her blood run cold. On the nightstand beside the bed sat an open Bible, its pages turned to Revelations, the text marked with what appeared to be fresh ink despite the passage of centuries. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. Emily backed away from the Bible, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she was seeing. Ink didn't remain wet for 200 years. Books left open to the elements didn't maintain their crisp, readable condition without constant care and preservation. She fled the house and began a systematic survey of the other buildings, each one revealing the same impossible preservation, the same sense of life recently interrupted rather than long abandoned. In the blacksmith shop, coals still glowed faintly in the forge, though there was no source of fuel visible and no explanation for how a fire could burn unattended for centuries. The church proved to be the most disturbing location of all. The wooden pews were arranged facing an altar that bore fresh flowers, wildflowers that bloomed nowhere else in the mountain valley, but somehow maintained their color and fragrance in the dim interior. The air inside the church felt different, charged with an energy that made Emily's skin crawl with invisible static. Behind the altar, she discovered a door that led to what appeared to be a root cellar or storage space beneath the church. The wooden steps creaked under her weight as she descended into the darkness, her flashlight beam revealing stone walls carved with symbols that predated any Christian iconography she recognized. At the bottom of the steps, Emily found herself in a circular chamber that clearly served some ritualistic purpose. The stone floor was marked with intricate patterns carved deep into the rock, designs that seemed to shift and writhe in the beam of her flashlight. Along the walls, alcoves contained objects that made no sense in the context of a Puritan settlement. Animal bones arranged in complex geometric patterns, jars containing substances that defied identification, wooden masks with expressions of ecstasy and terror carved into their primitive features. But it was the center of the chamber that nearly sent Emily fleeing back up the steps in panic. A circular pit had been carved into the stone floor, its depths disappearing beyond the reach of her flashlight. The edges of the pit were stained with something dark that had soaked into the rock over countless years, and the air rising from the depths carried a smell that combined sulfur, decay, and something else entirely, something that triggered primal fears buried deep in human DNA. Around the pit, positioned as if they had been kneeling when they died, were the remains of approximately 200 people. Men, women, and children still clothed in the tatters of 18th century garments, their bones arranged in postures of worship or supplication. Some still clutched wooden crosses or prayer books, while others held objects Emily couldn't identify, but that radiated the same malevolent energy as the symbols carved into the walls. Emily forced herself to approach the remains with scientific detachment, documenting the scene with her camera while trying to understand what had happened in this chamber 2 centuries ago. The positioning of the skeletons suggested they had died willingly, participants in some ritual that had required their voluntary sacrifice. As she worked, Emily became aware of a sound that hadn't been there when she first entered the chamber. A low humming that seemed to emanate from the pit itself, rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested breathing or chanting. The sound was barely audible, more felt than heard, but it carried undertones that made her teeth ache and her vision blur at the edges. She retreated up the steps and out of the church, gasping for air that tasted clean and normal after the oppressive atmosphere of the underground chamber. But the humming sound followed her, growing stronger as the morning progressed, until it became a constant background presence that she couldn't ignore or escape. Emily tried to leave the village then, following the path back toward the forest and her car, but discovered that the trail had changed. Where before it had been clear and well-defined, now it branched in multiple directions, each path leading deeper into the woods rather than back to Morrison's abandoned camp. She spent hours trying different routes, using her compass and GPS device to maintain direction, but every path eventually curved back toward the village center. As the sun reached its zenith overhead, Emily was forced to accept that she was trapped in Whitmore Hollow by some force that transcended normal geography. The humming grew stronger throughout the afternoon, joined by other sounds that seemed to come from the empty buildings around her. Footsteps on wooden floors, the creak of doors opening and closing, voices speaking in whispers too soft to understand, but carrying emotions of desperate urgency. As evening approached, Emily barricaded herself inside Morrison's tent back at the abandoned camp, using his research materials to try to piece together what had happened to the village and what was happening to her. The historical records he had gathered painted a picture of Whitmore Hollow as a thriving community right up until its mysterious abandonment in 1798. But Morrison had also uncovered older records, documents that spoke of the village's founding by a group of religious dissidents who had broken away from mainstream Puritanism due to their belief in direct communication with divine forces. The community had been led by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Whitmore, who claimed to have received visions that revealed the location of a sacred site where the boundaries between heaven and earth were thin. According to the records, Whitmore and his followers had built their village around this sacred site, incorporating it into the foundation of their church and using it as the center of increasingly elaborate religious ceremonies. The final entry in the town records, written by someone whose identity had been obscured by water damage, spoke of a great revelation that would transform the community and allow them to transcend the limitations of mortal existence. As darkness fell over the valley, Emily understood with horrible clarity what that revelation had been. The villagers hadn't disappeared in 1798. They had died willingly in that underground chamber, participants in a ritual that was designed to bind their souls to the physical location of Whitmore Hollow, creating a pocket of existence that existed outside normal time and space. The humming sound grew louder with the coming of night, joined by voices that were no longer whispered but spoke clearly in the colonial-era English of the village's original inhabitants. They called to Emily from the darkness beyond her tent, promising revelations and spiritual transformation, begging her to join them in their eternal worship. Emily tried to radio for help, but her equipment produced only static. She attempted to start her car, but the engine wouldn't turn over despite having run perfectly during her drive up the mountain. Every rational option for escape had been systematically eliminated, leaving her with the growing realization that she was meant to be here, that her arrival was not coincidence, but the fulfillment of some plan that had been set in motion centuries ago. As midnight approached, Emily heard Morrison's voice among the chorus calling from the village center. He spoke her name with gentle insistence, explaining that he understood now why he'd been drawn to Whitmore Hollow, why his research had led him to this place at this particular time. "The work isn't finished, Emily," his voice drifted through the darkness. "We thought they had disappeared, but they're still here, still waiting for the final ritual that will allow them to complete their transformation. They need us to help them finish what they started." Emily left her tent and walked down the path toward the village, drawn by forces beyond her conscious control. The buildings glowed with soft, welcoming light, and she could see figures moving between the houses, going about their daily routines as if no time at all had passed since 1798. In the church, the congregation was gathered for the final service, 200 souls plus Morrison and his research team, all waiting patiently for Emily to take her place among them. Ezekiel Whitmore stood at the altar, his face radiant with divine ecstasy as he gestured for her to approach. "Welcome, sister," he said in a voice that carried the authority of absolute faith. "We have been waiting so long for you to arrive. The circle is finally complete, and we can begin the great work that will transform this place into a gateway between worlds." Emily found herself walking down the aisle toward the altar, her feet moving without conscious direction. Part of her mind screamed warnings, but a larger part felt only relief at finally understanding her purpose, her role in a cosmic plan that had been unfolding for centuries. As she reached the altar, Emily saw that the floor of the church had changed. The wooden boards had been removed, revealing the stone chamber beneath with its carved symbols and central pit. The congregation began to sing, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to resonate through dimensions beyond the physical world. Emily descended the steps into the chamber and took her place beside Morrison at the edge of the pit. Below them, something vast and ancient stirred in depths that had no bottom, responding to the call of voices raised in worship and sacrifice. As dawn broke over Whitmore Hollow, the village fell silent once again, its buildings standing empty under the pale morning light. But in the underground chamber beneath the church, Emily and Morrison joined their voices to the eternal chorus of souls who had chosen transformation over escape, becoming part of a congregation that would wait patiently for the next researchers, the next visitors who would be drawn to this place where the boundaries between worlds had worn dangerously thin. The silence was absolute once more, profound and expectant, waiting for the next dawn when new voices might join the song that echoed endlessly in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments between breaths, in the eternal now of Whitmore Hollow. This was another tale from the SDF Horror Vault. If you felt the chill tonight, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. New stories open soon. And remember, the vault is always waiting.